Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into a single fundamental problem that secretly runs the show when it comes to your computer's performance. And here's a hint. It has very little to do with how powerful your processor is and everything to do with the massive bottleneck it hits every single nanosecond. Look, we all want our computers to be lightning fast, right? But that leads to a huge paradox. Why is your computer's brain, the CPU, so unbelievably faster than its memory? I mean, this speed difference is so enormous, it literally shapes the design of every single computer on the planet. So just how vast are we talking? Well, it can be as big as 10 million to 1. That's the difference between a modern CPU core asking for a piece of data and a classic hard disk actually going to find it. To put that in perspective, imagine a world-class chef who can cook an entire meal in 1 second, but they have to wait almost 4 months for their assistant to just hand them an onion. That is your CPU, all day, every day. Computer engineers have a name for this. They call it the Great Speed Gap, and you could argue it's the single biggest headache in modern computer architecture. Why? Because a processor, no matter how fast, is only as good as the data it can get its hands on. And because of this gap, your CPU spends a truly shocking amount of its time just waiting, literally twiddling its digital thumbs for data to finally show up. Okay, so if building a single type of memory that's as fast as the CPU is basically impossible or, just ridiculously expensive, what do? Well, the solution engineers came up with was way more clever. Instead of one perfect memory, they created a tiered system, a really ingenious hierarchy where each level has its own specific job to do. And honestly, the absolute best way to get this is with a workshop analogy. Think of the CPU as a master craftsman working at an insane speed. The cache? That's their tiny workbench, where the tools they need right now are within arm's reach. The RAM is the bigger tool chest over on the other side of the room, still accessible, but takes a moment to get to. And the disk? Well, that's the giant warehouse down the street. Every step you take away from that craftsman is a longer trip and a bigger, more painful delay. And this whole hierarchy exists for one simple reason, a fundamental trade-off. It's that classic engineering problem. You've got speed, size, and low cost, but you only get to pick two. Cache is blindingly fast, but it's tiny and costs a fortune per gigabyte. Your disk storage is huge and cheap, but it's glacially slow in comparison. And RAM? Well, RAM sits right there in the middle. You just can't get all three in one package. So how in the world does the computer know what to put on that super fast workbench versus what to leave in the slow warehouse? Well, the magic that makes this whole system work is a concept called the principle of locality. And it's based on two really simple but incredibly powerful observations. First, temporal locality just means if you just used a piece of data, chances are you're going to need it again, like right away. And spatial locality means if you just grab data from one spot, you're probably about to need the data stored right next to it. Basically, programs are creatures of habit. They're predictable. So let's see how this actually plays out second by second. When the CPU needs some data, it doesn't immediately go running down to the warehouse. Nope. First, it checks its workbench, the cache. If the data it needs is right there, that's called a cache hit. Perfect. Work just keeps going at full speed. But if it's not there, that's a cache miss. Now the processor has to stop everything and wait for that data to be fetched from farther away. Every single cache miss is a tiny little performance penalty, and the entire goal of this system is to have as few of them as possible. And you can take this idea even deeper. I mean, think about it for a second. Your main RAM, that big tool chest we talked about, it's really just one giant cache for your much slower disk drive. When you double-click an icon to open a program, your operating system pulls the important bits from the disk, the warehouse, and caches them in RAM for much faster access. It's just caches all the way down. And this brings us to a really crucial point, which our source material captures perfectly. The real performance isn't lost because one part is slow. It's lost in those gaps, in the waiting, in those subtle interactions between all of these different layers. Which means the best way to think about your computer's speed isn't as a solo by some rockstar CPU, it's a symphony. Sure, the CPU might be the first violin, playing a blistering solo, but that performance is completely meaningless if the percussion, the cache, and the rest of the string section, the RAM, aren't all perfectly in sync with it. It's the harmony between all the parts that creates a beautiful, fast experience. And this whole concept directly explains why certain computer upgrades make such a huge difference. When you swap out an old hard drive for an SSD, you've just replaced your horse and cart warehouse with a high-speed freight train. You've dramatically sped up the longest, slowest trips for data. When you add more RAM, you've just given your craftsmen a much, much bigger tool chest. So when you're multitasking, they have to make way fewer trips to the warehouse. It's why these changes, even with the exact same processor, can make your machine feel brand new.
So, all of this leaves us with one big, forward-looking question. The memory hierarchy we've just talked about, it's served us incredibly well for decades. But now, with the absolute explosion of data from things like AI and massive scientific models, the demands are just becoming astronomical. So what's next? What brilliant new layers will engineers have to invent to bridge the next great speed gap?